My name is Katie Shoemaker, and I teach in the Constitutional Studies program here, and I'm here to introduce Professor Alan Kraut. Alan M. Kraut is Distinguished Professor of History at American University and a Fellow of the Migration Policy Institute, specializing in immigration, ethnic history, and the history of medicine in the United States. He is the author or editor of 9 books and many scholarly articles, too numerous to name. These volumes include The Huddled Masses, The Immigrant in American Society, 1880 to 1921, Silent Travelers, Germs, Genes, and the Immigrant Menace, Goldberger's War, The Life and Work of a Public Health Crusader, the co-authored volume Covenant of Care, Newark, Beth Israel, and the Jewish Hospital in America, and most recently, Ethnic Historians in the Mainstream, Shaping America's Immigration Story. He is currently writing a history of xenophobia and nativism throughout American history. Among the awards his publications have received are the Immigration and Ethnic History Society's Theodore Salutos Prize, the Society for History in the Federal Government's Henry Adams Prize, the American Public Health Association's Arthur Faciltier Prize, and the New Jersey Studies Academic Alliance's Authors Award. Professor Kraut's research has been supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Institutes of Health. He is a past president of the Organization of American Historians and serves as current president of the National Coalition for History. He's also an elected fellow of the Society of American Historians. In 2017, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. Please welcome Alan Kraut.
Thank you, Katie. It's truly a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I want to especially thank Dean David Roble and Professor Justin Wirt for issuing the invitation that brought me here this afternoon, as well as Ms. Helen Green. I think my colleague Katie Benton-Cohen was quite right. We all need a Helen Green to organize our lives and events. And of course to Katie Schumacher for the lovely introduction. I have never been to Oklahoma before. But as a kid from the Bronx who grew up in the 1950s, walking distance to Yankee Stadium, I feel very close and a very close bond. Mickey Mantle of Commerce, Oklahoma was my idol. I only became a historian because I lacked the talent to play center field for the Yankees. And when Mantle died in 1995, the comedian Billy Crystal confessed that he had practiced his bar mitzvah speech in an Oklahoma twang out of respect for the Mick. I can only tell you that Billy Crystal was not alone. Those of us who watched Mantle on those Bronx Sunday afternoons were told that big, strong guys like the Mick was what American and Americans were really about. One of the perennial challenges posed by immigration to the United States has been the suspicion of those already here that newcomers will not or cannot integrate themselves into American society and culture. In my recent work on nativism in American history, I've concluded that fear of the foreign-born as a subversive influence is a constant, a thread that runs through the fabric of American life in every period of our history. At times, that fear is blazing hot in its intensity. At other times, it is on low burner, but never is it completely extinguished. Certainly, nativism has been an American theme prominent in the 21st century. Prior to the presidential election of 2016, then candidate Donald Trump characterized undocumented migrants from Mexico as rapists and prostitutes. Following his election, his appointees in the White House, such as Stephen Bannon, and then later Stephen Miller, offered equally uncomplimentary portraits of those wishing to cross our border as immigrant or refugee. White supremacists and neo-Nazis joined the Unite the Right demonstration in Charlottesville, taking the message of unwelcome into the streets, carrying burning torches, semi-automatic rifles, and banners referencing Nazi and Nordic mythology, while shouting racist, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and anti-Semitic chants. Even respected intellectuals and academics have proven susceptible to nativist anxieties. The late Samuel P. Huntington of Harvard University, a distinguished political scientist, surprised many in 2004 by expressing his fear that America's newest arrivals could not or would not accept what he regarded as the legacy of the earliest British settlers, including Protestant values, the English language, individualism, religiosity, and respect for written law. He was especially perturbed by the robust Mexican migration to the United States, legal as well as unauthorized. He claimed there was, quote, a weak identification with America on the part of Mexican immigrants and peoples of Mexican origins. He believed that curbing Mexican immigration entailed many benefits. Not only would the wages of low-income Americans improve, but there would be cultural advantages as well. He wrote, quote, debates over the use of Spanish and whether English should be made the official language of state and national governments would fade away. Bilingual education and the controversies it spawns would decline. The possibility of a de facto split between predominantly Spanish-speaking America and English-speaking America would disappear, and with it, a major potential threat to the cultural and perhaps political integrity of the United States. All of that from curbing Mexican migration, in his view. The concern as to who will fit in and who will not, I would suggest to you this afternoon, is old wine in new bottles. And today I want to offer you some perspective on the present apprehension about integrating newcomers into American society by exploring the claims of prominent and powerful nativists at an earlier peak period of immigration, the turn of the 20th century. On October 12, 1915, former President Theodore Roosevelt mounted the stage at New York's Carnegie Hall to address the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic fraternal organization. Catholics had long been the target of American nativism. In the antebellum era, Irish Catholics were the target of Protestant mobs, which burned convents, like the Charlestown convent in Massachusetts. Irish Catholics were the target of the Know Nothing Party, a small political faction that ran candidates very successfully in some states in the years prior to the Civil War, and eventually merged themselves into the modern Republican Party, which was founded in the middle 1850s. When they joined the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln was very quick to denounce them. He wrote to his friend Joshua Speed, "I am not a know-nothing, that is certain. How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? When the know-nothings get control, our Declaration of Independence will read, 'All men are created equal, except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics.' And when it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy," end quote. Well, immigrants responded to all of this with a saying that lasted throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century. America beckons, but Americans repel. Yes, Americans need immigrants to settle the land, to work in industry, to go deep into the mines, to do the jobs that native-born Americans wouldn't do. But when they arrived, when they responded to the courting gestures, they often felt that they were repelled, that they were not welcome in this land. Now, when T.R. was addressing the Knights of Columbus Italian and Polish Catholics were the main nativist targets, not as much the Irish. T.R. coined a phrase that would long outlive him when he assured the Knights of Columbus audience that, quote, "What is true of creed is no less true of nationality. There is no room in this country for hyphenated Americanism." While not all naturalized immigrants were hyphenated Americans in T.R.'s eyes, he did insist that, quote, "A hyphenated American is not an American at all." He said, "Americanism is a matter of the spirit and of the soul. Our allegiance must be purely to the United States. We must unsparingly condemn any man who holds any other allegiance. But if he is heartily and singly loyal to this republic, then no matter where he was born, he is just as good an American as anyone else," end quote. So Roosevelt was critical of those who discriminated against the foreign-born simply because of where they had been born. He told the Carnegie Hall crowd, "Any discrimination against aliens is a wrong, for it tends to put the immigrant at a disadvantage and to cause him to feel bitterness and resentment during the very years when he should be preparing himself for American citizenship. If an immigrant is not fit to become a citizen, he should not be allowed to come here. If he is fit, he should be given all the rights to earn his own livelihood and to better himself that any man can possibly have." Whatever Roosevelt's concerns about hyphenated Americans, this is the term that he coined, he was convinced that newcomers desiring to do so could be fully assimilated into American life. Not all those witnessing the mass migration which brought 23.5 newcomers to the United States between the 1880s and the 1920s shared Roosevelt's optimism. Some of them passed the Chinese exclusion law of 1882 or participated in anti-Chinese violence, like the terrible persecution of the Chinese in Rock Springs, Wyoming, which this cartoon depicts. One who did not agree with T.R. was his close friend and prolific xenophobe, Madison Grant. The wealthy Grant was an attorney, a world traveler, a conservationist, a founder of the New York Zoological Society, trustee of the American Museum of Natural History, and with Teddy Roosevelt, an architect of the national park system. Grant was born 7 months after the end of the Civil War on November 19, 1865. His father was descended from the first Puritan settlers in New England, while his mother was of French Huguenot stock. Madison's youth was spent largely at a country estate on Long Island, built by his maternal grandfather. Private schools and long vacations abroad were followed by a distinguished academic career at Yale and a law degree from Columbia University. He practiced law, but had strong avocational interests, especially in all things related to nature. And he and Teddy Roosevelt worked for conservation and to preserve and further the sport of big game hunting, preventing the depletion of the deer population through regulation. Regulation. When it came to humanity, Grant also favored regulation. In 1916, Madison Grant published The Passing of the Great Race, which reflected his understanding of an existing natural order, or a hierarchy. Observing the flow of immigration into the United States, Grant feared that the racial stock arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe was vastly inferior to that which had arrived from Northern and Western Europe. He feared the mixing of the races would be catastrophic for the future of the United States. In Grant's terminology, the superior stock was the Nordic race, a construct he created by which he meant a loosely defined group having both distinctive biological and cultural characteristics. The group emerged from Scandinavia, and Grant credited it with all the favorable traits associated with the American pioneering breed. He identified the Alpine race as those from Central Europe, inferior to the Nordic race, but still far superior to the Mediterranean race from areas ringing the Mediterranean Sea. Committed to the young science of eugenics that you've heard about earlier today, popular with intellectuals on both sides of the Atlantic, Grant supported planned breeding, even as he advocated planned regulation of animal populations and conservation of plants and trees. That's the intellectual connection. Inferior traits must never be permitted to enter the Nordic gene pool. Proposed practical techniques, quarantine, separation, planned breeding, would, in his eyes, eliminate the undesirable traits and provide for greater procreation among those with desirable traits to sustain the Nordic type in the human gene pool. There was very little doubt in Grant's mind that in addition to regulating human reproduction with eugenics goals in mind, public policy would be necessary to limit the arrival of the unfit via migration. And from 1922 to his death in 1937, Grant was a vice president of an organization committed to these policies, the Immigration Restriction League. He enthusiastically supported in word and deed the data collection required to structure the national origins quota system, made permanent in the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 that Katie Benton-Cohen mentioned this morning. Grant was also actively supporting laws that forbade miscegenation, mixed marriage, such as the state of Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924. He argued that every available legal instrument must be marshaled to preserve the integrity of America's pioneering breed. As did many nativists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Grant made the case that full assimilation by non-Nordics was not only undesirable, but impossible. Any advantages gained in the immediate environment by assisting or educating could not possibly offset the influence of heredity. Heredity, not environment, was primary. And so for Grant, as for many other nativists of his era, the Jew, the Eastern European Jew, was the perfect target, the perfect example of environment being unable to trump deficiencies acquired at birth. In The Passing of the Great Race, Grant wrote that just as a Syrian or just as an Egyptian freedman could not possibly be transformed into a Roman by wearing a toga and applauding his favorite gladiator in the amphitheater, so too it would be impossible to transform the Polish Jew, whose dwarf stature, peculiar mentality, and ruthless concentration on self-interest are being grafted upon the stock of the nation. This is what he said would be impossible. Grant regarded Jewish blood as a dominating contaminant, and thus the cross between a Nordic, an Alpine, or even a Mediterranean and a Jew would always produce a Jew. Sounds very, very much like the drop laws of the American South with respect to the African American population. Now, Theodore Lothrop Stoddard was Grant's protege. His background was very similar to Grant's. He graduated from Harvard in 1905. And like Grant, he studied law. He attended Boston University, but he didn't earn a degree. He left in 1908, and instead he earned a PhD in history from Harvard in 1914. He shared with Madison Grant an absolute fixation on the relationship of race to the development of civilization. Accepting Grant's racial trinity of Nordic, Alpine, and Mediterranean, Stoddard viewed Jews as Asiatics. Their presence in the immigration stream threatened the racial supremacy of Nordics. Stoddard's opposition to immigration was part of a reflection of his own desire to exert social control by limiting the number of poor who might revolt if pressed too hard in their competition for society's resources. Birth control, as yet still scandalous to some, was one way of forestalling what Stoddard regarded as a threatening explosion in the population of the underclass, a thesis that he explored in his 1922 volume, The Revolt Against Civilization, The Menace of the Underman. Another essential protection would be immigration restriction. Stoddard applauded the immigration restrictions of the 1920s. He enthusiastically embraced all efforts to sustain the majority of individuals of Northern European origins in the American population. In another book he published in the 1920s, The Rising Tide of the Threat Against White World Supremacy, Stoddard observed that the Industrial Revolution had made it difficult for the Nordic race to prosper and perpetuate itself because, quote, the cramped factory and crowded city weeded out the big blonde Nordic with portentous rapidity, whereas the little brunette Mediterranean, in particular, adapted himself to the operative's bench or the clerk's stool, prospered, and reproduced his kind. Stoddard regarded human migration as a handicap for all of civilization's advancement. There can be, I think, little question that Stoddard's theories and terminology resonated with many of the Nazis who rose to power in Germany after 1933. The term Stoddard used in the subtitle of his 1920 volume, Underman, was redeployed by Nazi chief theorist Alfred Rosenberg, who called those deemed racially inferior in the Third Reich Untermenschen. Stoddard actually visited Nazi Germany as a journalist between 1939 and 1940. He was treated with tremendous deference and respect by Nazi officials, and during his visit, Stoddard was even permitted to observe the hereditary health court in Charlottenburg. It was an appeals court established to hear cases of those wishing to elude forced sterilization consistent with the nation's eugenics laws. In his published memoir of the visit, Stoddard expressed his view that the courts were at times too hesitant to insist on sterilization. They should do it more often. He applauded the laws that seemed to him successful in weeding out the worst strains in the Germanic stock in a scientific and a truly humanitarian way. He felt that sterilization was humanitarian. No friend of Jewish immigration to the United States, Stoddard described his surprise that the Germans were so candid in expressing their hatred for the Jews. He was convinced that the Germans would find a solution to the Jewish problem, but he thought that the answer might lay in expulsion. Not even Stoddard envisioned that there would be mass extermination and that the final solution to the Jewish question in Europe would be the use of Zyklon B gas. The real puzzle here is that many nativists also identified as progressives, adherents to the political philosophy that rational advancement in science and technology, social organization, and economic development and government are crucial to improving the human condition. Highly educated men and women committed to such principles might be expected to abhor bigotry and discrimination. However, many progressives found in nativism the salvation of a country that seemed to be threatened, mortally menaced, in fact, by industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. Immigrants from non-democratic societies seemed to threaten to dump upon America's shores rivals ill-suited to preserving freedom and democratic government. Moreover, their perceived biological inferiority made many Eastern Europeans and Southern Italians and Russian Jews unlikely to incorporate themselves into an American population whose roots were in Western Europe. Arguments like those presented by Grant and Stoddard were crucial in passing the highly restrictive Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 that we've mentioned. This is Albert Johnson from Washington and his colleague David Reed from Pennsylvania. 2% of the group's population already in the United States, according to the 1890 census, would be the number of people admitted annually from that group. Katie Benton-Cohen mentioned this morning. This was a kind of percentage operation, a way of limiting the newcomers who are arriving in ever greater number from Southern and Eastern Europe. Southern Italians, Eastern European Jews, Poles, Russians, and so on. It was, of course, Calvin Coolidge who signed that legislation and who commented when he did that he regarded this as a humane approach to the regulation of the American population. The law was not revised until 1965, and then Philip Hart of Michigan and the much-beloved Emanuel Seller of Brooklyn, New York, revised the 1965 law in such a way that it eliminated the national origins quota system, substituted hemispheric quotas, and allowed much more readily from people to arrive from parts of the world that had been limited before, parts of Asia, parts of Latin America, and so on. Today, this law, by the way, was signed by Lyndon Johnson, who was standing on Liberty Island at the time in 1965. Today, the current administration seeks to dramatically reduce the number of arrivals using the likely to become a public charge provision of the law to pursue an overall reduction in annual immigration admissions. Economic uncertainties, especially the incomplete and uneven recovery from the 2008 recession, has only served to nourish the fear of the foreign-born for both economic and cultural reasons. Fear of the unfamiliar is hardly new. Commenting on the power of fear throughout history, British philosopher Bertrand Russell once observed, quote, "Collective fear stimulates herd instinct and tends to produce ferocity toward those who are not regarded as members of the herd." Today, a well-educated American elite, descended from earlier waves of newcomers, is part of a larger global elite that reaches across boundaries and borders to help the world's dispossessed, including new arrivals in the United States. Unfortunately, this is often done or perceived to be done at the expense of a domestic rank and file that feels victimized and displaced by those they regard as other. For those feeling displaced and diminished, fighting City Hall to assert their claims seems problematic because all too often the agenda is being set by global interests based in one region of the country or abroad. Economic concerns are not confined by national borders. The end result is a backlash by groups across the globe that seem to resemble one another in their xenophobic extremism. And yet the context in the United States is actually quite different. Compared with other countries, the U.S. is still a young nation, built on tides of immigration that are fresh in the public mind. Our arguments over immigration restriction take as a given that immigration is a constant in American life, for the most part. We argue over how many immigrants to admit, not over whether we should be admitting immigrants at all. Today, the United States is not alone in seeking to narrow passage across its borders. Right-wing groups in France, Germany, and the Netherlands are not constrained by the same heritage of opening the door to mass migration, even in the worst of times. The genius of American life to date has been the majority's ability to reconcile our fears with our belief that even those not of the herd by birth can still join it through the force of will and effort. Newcomers can negotiate their membership in American society even in times of increased nativism. Those sentiments were perhaps best captured in the words of Edward Kennedy in the introduction to a volume authored by his brother, John F. Kennedy, the first and so far only Roman Catholic president, a possibility that seemed remote when Teddy Roosevelt addressed the Knights of Columbus. Senator Kennedy reminded his readers, quote, "Immigration is in our blood. It's part of our founding story." In 2008, he observed that, as in the past, immigrants today come from all corners of the world, representing every race and creed. They work hard, they practice their faith, they love their families, and they love this country. We would not be a great nation without them. But whether we remain true to that history and heritage is a major challenge. A major challenge. A dozen years later, mass immigration policy reform remains high on the country's 21st agenda list. The separating of migrant children from their parents and put in separate facilities is, we hope, a vile aberration. It has not been a time-honored policy. What happens next, in the decades to come, depends very much on how vigilant the American majority remains against the nativist vigilantes that exist in our time, as they have all too often in the American past. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for questions. If you have a question, if you could raise your hand, and I will direct a microphone-wielding undergraduate your way. All right, in the back there.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. My question is a little bit about terminology. So I noticed you were using the term nativist a lot, and I assume that that's maybe for historical reasons. But I wonder what was your thinking behind choosing that word, and why you wouldn't use something like white supremacist, or how you would reconcile that with other dialogues that are happening around Native American claims. And so just really a question about that terminology and why you chose it, and how you might change it to accommodate some other discourses about Native American identity.
Yeah, I use the term nativist occasionally interchangeably with xenophobe, but I like the term nativist because it embodies the concept of a kind of ultra-nationalism, or if you will, the herd instinct that Bertrand Russell was talking about. An earlier historian, John Hyam, who wrote a book called Strangers in the Land, said that there were three genres of nativism: anti-Catholicism, racial nativism, and anti-radical nativism. And later in his career, he added to that anti-Semitism, which he felt was a separate and distinct genre of bias based in this kind of hyper-nationalism. And I, too, think that there's a kind of hyper-nationalism afoot here, which causes us to want to exclude those who are not born to the nation, who are not of the herd. And that's why I use the term nativism so often.
Could you tell me, please, if Grant or Stoddard, as I'm not certain of the dates, were part of the eugenics movement in the United States, which some historians say taught Hitler about doing the Holocaust?
There's no question that both Grant and Stoddard were supportive of the eugenics movement. They definitely were. At Nuremberg, several of the Nazi defendants argued that a lot of what they had learned about eugenics and eugenics concepts came from American thinkers. And it's very true that during this period, there was a lot of cross-pollinization back and forth between the United States and Germany. It's coming.
First, thank you for coming all the way to Oklahoma for the first time. I just wanted to clarify what I think might have been implicit in the previous question about the term nativism. I think people who haven't studied the history of political parties and anti-immigrant hysteria and ideology don't know or haven't heard that the term nativist is a historical term that meant, as Native American meant, not the peoples that we know today were indigenous to these parts, particularly places
had nothing
like
to do with that.
Oklahoma. I understand that. I just wanted to clarify for people who ask the question, if they hear nativism for the first time in history courses, for example, they don't understand that that term has been used with a capital N since the 1840s or earlier to refer to anti-immigrant sentiment in favor of people who were born, who were in the nation, as you put it, meaning for them often a Nordic or racially identified nation that did not include the peoples that we think of, recognize, sometimes with the term native, though that's a pretty historically new usage, other times with the word indigenous. And I just wanted to clarify that because I know my students, need some time to absorb that. And particularly, I think in a place like Oklahoma where, it's used to be called Indian country, and now native means something else, and it's often fighting words. Thank you again.
Yeah, I'm going to try again. So thanks for that clarification. So I think what I really wanted to ask and what I would like to hear you elaborate on is if you have considered Native thoughts informing your analysis of this historical progression that you're talking about in this time period. And if you were to do that, what that might look like specifically focusing and centering Native Americans and thinking about your presentation.
Yeah. A lot of the thinking of people like T.R. and Madison Grant was that Native Americans represented to them sort of man in nature, uncivilized, uncouth, definitely in need of civilizing, but at the same time having a certain beauty because they were closer to nature. And you see this in some of the exhibits that were mounted at the Museum of Natural History in New York. They often refer to them as noble savages. Well, savage is not exactly a nice word to use about anybody, but the nobility part came from what they thought they observed in patterns of warfare, in family relationships, in religiosity, and so on. So they liked the Native Americans on a certain level. They didn't regard them as the equivalent of Nordics or the other groups, the Alpines, but they certainly saw them as not unworthy of some praise, but without question, people of an inferior order. Other questions? Somebody over there.
Hello. Do you see any comparisons between the spread of far-right ideology between the United States and Europe at the turn of the early 20th century compared to some of the stuff going on now? Some white nationalist individuals like Steve Bannon are trying to set up far-right training centers in Eastern Europe, trying to spread this ideology. So would you say that it is kind of a comparable spread of this ideology along right-wing terms?
Yeah, as I do my work, I begin to take a look at what stuff does Steve Bannon read, what websites does Stephen Miller look at? Who else, on what programs are they serving as speakers and so on? And I'm very struck by the fact that Bannon in particular is steeping himself in a lot of the novels and philosophical treatises that come out of extreme right-wing European thought right now. And for me, it's not unlike this transatlantic dialogue over race, religion, ethnicity, and limiting migration that occurred at an earlier period. In both cases, there's a sense on their part that white civilization is being overrun. There's an extreme racism that's a sort of a shared body of thought among these thinkers. And that, too, strikes me a lot like the early part of the 20th century.
Time for one more question, if there's anyone down here. There's one.
Lady right over here.
She's coming.
I'm Helen Duchamp. While you were talking, I got to thinking about Leonardo da Vinci.
That's a nice thought to have. I think.
Yeah. But he was born of a servant girl, a bastard, if you will. So how would we discover Leonardo da Vinci's in our newcomers?
Well, I think as earlier speakers have said this afternoon and this morning, we have physicians and scientists and novelists among the newcomers who are arriving in the United States, and engineers and people who will create the next generation of vaccines. And we are fools if we keep them out of the United States or we prevent them from having a normal transition from foreign-born to citizen. The loss will be ours, not just theirs. And so I think your point is very well taken. We want the new Leonardos. We want the new scientists. I always think about people like Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin and the polio vaccine, and what it would have meant to society had their parents been kept out of the United States by some of the nativist efforts and legislation that was being posed. What would that loss mean? It would be incalculable. And so I think we have always been nourished and improved as a nation of nations, a nation of immigrants. Why quit a good thing? And I've been very struck as I travel around the country and give talks that when I come across associations of business people who I often think are going to be very, very anti-immigration, very conservative in their political views, and quite the opposite. They're yearning for new engineers, new ideas. I mean, the number of patents alone that have been created by the foreign-born in the United States since the Second World War is astronomical. Think about what a loss that would be to the country had they been kept out of this society and marginalized in our society. So I think the point that Tomas made before, and we've been hearing all day, about how essential it is to welcome, to keep the doors open, to embrace, and to provide clear paths to legalization and citizenship and so on, very, very important. One of the people I work with at the Migration Policy Institute is Doris Meisner, who was the commissioner of INS under Bill Clinton. And in the last years of the Clinton administration, Doris and others pushed very, very hard to encourage the new arrivals to embrace citizenship. And a number of people have said that when we give diplomas to our foreign-born students, we ought to have inside the diploma envelope a green card for them so that we benefit from the kind of educational opportunities we've provided. This is something we have embraced in the past to our advantage, and that we need to embrace right now more than ever. Thank you.